Most mortgage lenders charge a fee, sometimes up to 1.5 points for pulling cash out of your home's equity. Those points are on your whole loan balance, not just the cash you get. For example, if your loan amount is $400,000, that's a $6,000 fee. For limited time, Owning will waive this fee so qualified borrowers can get a cash-out refi with absolutely no closing costs of any kind. Besides the usual no title, escrow, appraisal, etc., no fees for a cash-out on a 30-year fixed mortgage. So if you're in process somewhere and paying fees, call 8332-OWNING or go to owning.com, where our rate and APR for a no cash out fee 30-year fixed mortgage is 2.75%. But hurry, the mortgage industry won't like this, so who knows when this special goes away. Call 8332-OWNING or go to owning.com.
NMLS 2611, licensed by the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation under the California Residential Mortgage Lending Act. Subject to credit approval. Call 833-303-2160 for terms and conditions. Equal housing lender.
Innovation, resilience, agility. It's how Michigan businesses work together and continue to build the future. Our expertise, talented workforce, and collaborative environment are making a difference now and shaping the future. Join us and make your mark where it matters. Visit michiganbusiness.org/radio to put your plans in motion. That's michiganbusiness.org/radio.
200 years ago seems like a very long time, but when you think about it, it really isn't, especially when you talk about the Santa Fe Trail that ran right through Kansas City, stopping at 3 different locations right in our metro that led settlers out west. Diane Houston and I take a look at the Santa Fe Trail and what it meant to the area and how it helped Kansas City grow. Well, Diane, 200 years, that is a very, very, very long time, almost as old as you and I, right? 200 years is how long the Santa Fe Trail has been around and been part of Kansas City. And a lot of times you'll drive through the Grandview Triangle and, you see the 3 trails crossing. You'll drive around, you'll see these brown signs that say Santa Fe Trail. But this was a vital passageway to really expand America, not just in Kansas City, but without this trail, I mean, we're talking about maybe America that doesn't get discovered till sometime later.
Yeah, totally. And the Santa Fe Trail was essential to the reason that this area grew, which I think is extremely important to bring up. And I love that you mentioned the Grandview Triangle, because do you remember they renamed it?
Yep.
There was like a whole vote for that. They're like, we're going to rename it.
I'm sure you were involved some way, right?
I wasn't in that. That was before my time. I was busy having beers in the bar. No, this was way beyond my time. And I remember when they changed it to 3 trails crossing, and it just kind of goes to show you, it's like, it's always going to be sandstone. It's always going to be Arrowhead.
Yep.
It's always going to be Arrowhead.
It is, no matter what it is, it's always going to be kind of what that original name is and what we all grew up calling it. I mean, everybody, it's not just here in Kansas City, but all over the world. Everybody knows the Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, all of that. But it was really started because Mexico finally gained independence, and it opened up kind of a whole new frontier for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So Mexico did get independence from Spain. And like you could imagine, because there was a monopoly and the Spanish had a monopoly in Mexico in that area, they would charge whatever they wanted for goods. And so when finally they got their independence from Spain, that opened up a legal trading route for the first time. And people just jumped right on board. They had to get, merchandise from the east out very far west for that time period. And it wasn't, a peaceful journey, because at this point, 1821 is also it's the bicentennial of the state of Missouri. Mm-hmm. So, we're just a state when this thing's happening here. legally being settled. And so everything out to the west, again, is Indian territory. So, mind your danger. They didn't care. They all wanted to make the big cash. That's why they did it.
I want to know about Bill Becknell, who was obviously the guy who, I shouldn't say obviously, people don't know. You don't know until you start reading this stuff like I did, because you do unbelievable work of telling us about everything that's happened in Kansas City for, the last 200 plus years. But he was the guy who strapped stuff onto a mule and says, all right, we're headed out right now. We're going to Santa Fe. He was kind of the guy that kind of started this whole thing.
He was. And I read an article in the Kansas City Star recently that was actually pretty interesting. Surprisingly so, about the Santa Fe Trail. Came out about the same time my article did about the Santa Fe Trail. But they brought up, that these old trails that were going across the countryside, if you will, would have been old Indian traces, which I think does need to be pointed out. So we're borrowing, everything that's new is when it was white. And I hate to say it that way, but history does kind of get told by the conquerors, if you will. And so there were trails that led out there. But what William Becknell did is he started from Old Franklin, which doesn't exist anymore because it's a floodplain. So they moved it to Newtown's name. They called it New Franklin. But the old Franklin, which is near Columbia-ish, if you will, and he decided, well, I'm going to get some goods and I'm going to, get some friends. He advertised and he said, I'm going to go out to, trade with Mexico. Who wants to come? And these people were, rough and tumble. They took all sorts of chances. And you're right. He did take mules. I'm like, that wouldn't have been my animal of choice.
What would you have taken back then? It's the 1800s. But are they more comfortable to ride? Do they have air conditioning? Do they have a 10-disc CD changer in their ass? What are we talking about here? Why an oxen?
Oxen carries more weight. That's one reason. They are slower, but there are some, and mules, there's a lot to do with how you outfit yourself. But at this point, the reason that they chose mules really was because that's what Mexico used. So it was just, why not? This is what's already being used. So he takes a pack train of mules along with his goods, gets out there, takes about 7 months. No big deal.
I was going to ask, how long are we talking here, man? This seems like a very long time. Like I got the image of a mule going clippity clop, really slow. And we're talking from here to like Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's not real close. 7 months to get this job done.
900 miles.
Wow.
So you talk about this kind of stuff so he goes and it's a miracle. It gets there. And then he's taking a gamble too, because he has no idea how he's going to trade. It all works out though. Miracles happen, right? And so he's able to return with a pretty, penny in his pocket, gets back, and within a year he's doing it again, but this time he did it with oxen. So this is all in 1821. And this guy, he made multiple trips overland, of course, is what you call it. And I love anytime I talk, I don't normally talk trails, and especially commerce trails, because, I like people. I like talking about people and things like that. And so this isn't normally my jam. But it is amazing to think that they were able to pull stuff like this off in 1821. Like, these are already people that are coming from other areas. Missouri's new to them. They're like, sure, why don't we just go across and see what happens? Hope Native Americans don't kill us on our way. It was dangerous, so dangerous. And I think it's interesting. So if you think about the trails being like an old trace, a lot of the pieces would have already kind of been there. This guy would have had to ford across at Arrow Rock, which is a great old town if you've never been there. They ferried across Arrow Rock to get across the river, and then they stay close to the riverbed, because it's going to be flatter near that. And they crossed over, and this is 1820s, and so there's nothing out here except for that Shoto's starting his trading post in downtown Kansas City. But there's really nothing out here, and it kind of goes near Lexington, Missouri. And then it crosses into Jackson County in the northeast corner, and then crosses down into like Raytown and across 435. So, right there where you can, spot, the old Bannister Mall / Cerner now. And it crosses over, and then it ends up going into what would have been the wilderness, Kansas territory. It wasn't even a territory yet, really. It goes into Kansas and around 122nd and State Line, which is exactly where I grew up. So that's why, in the town that was there was New Santa Fe, which comes in later. But so, this trail was old. And of course, you're going to go the easiest route. So they went just straight through, it's kind of like cutting corners instead of taking the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Through the yard. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But I think when you're going on a journey that far and that long, you've got to figure out a way to kind of shorten it up as much as you can. And so they kind of deviated from the plan, I guess, huh? Little left, little right, little left, little right, and end up where they finally needed to be.
Absolutely. And it's just like today. And I think that's also what's interesting, because I watched some people on social media almost fight over stuff like this, because they're like, well, the brown signs are by my house and this is where the trail was. And I'm like, you guys, there's more than one way to get somewhere.
Yeah.
Even back then, there was more than one way to get somewhere. And now, early on, there was one way to get there. You just kind of went that trail, and you're not stupid. If you go off course, you're just causing yourself an element of danger just doing that. And, I love like I said, I don't love talking about necessarily, it's not my normal topic to talk about like the Santa Fe Trail. But, you think about the Santa Fe, Oregon and California trails. And I, of course, think back to my younger days. Since you and I combined are about 200 years old, we've decided that the old Oregon Trail game, right? On the Apple computer. Who didn't start outfitting in Independence?
Right.
Who didn't have to ford the river? How many families did you kill? It's just, it's unbelievable, because you can play it online. old school Oregon Trail. You can play it online, and I make my students play it actually. And I give extra credit whoever makes it without killing anybody and with the most money.
Well, we all died from dysentery in that game.
Yes,
that's the one thing I truly remember. Like we're all dying from dysentery on that train or on that trail. But I mean, this trail was just kind of more than just a trail out west. I mean, it really did help kind of grow the area from Westport to Independence, downtown Kansas City. I mean, and even out in New Santa Fe, like at 122nd and State Line, where you said you grew up. I mean, it kind of touched all different parts of this city, right? It
did, and the way that the trails would grow, and you have to think, you're going to make the money by outfitting. And it's at this point, they're all brand new to this. So it's kind of like, hey, we're going to start in Old Franklin. That's where we start. That's just where you start. Mm-hmm. But then as time went by, Fort Osage was settled, in 1808-ish, that the fort was built, and that was right on the Missouri River. And so all of a sudden it became clear, wait a minute, let's do some math here. It's 100 miles ish from Old Franklin to the border. Okay. Around 100 miles. Well, if I take a flatboat, even before steamboats, if I take a flatboat with all my stuff on it, I don't have to walk. I don't have to ford the river. I can just take the river. So all of a sudden, it kind of occurs to them around into the 1820s, into the 30s. They're like, wait a minute, we could start further out west. Why wouldn't we do that? And so all of a sudden, an independence was created because, of course, when Jackson County was created, was formed as a county. 1827 is when independence was founded. And it was founded almost by the government, which is kind of interesting because you had to find a county seat. Well, how do you find a county seat when no one lives here? Mm-hmm. So it's like independence sounds good. So they kind of, and they looked for a spot that was going to be near river, of course, and you have to have water. There was a fresh spring there, and you had to have having the trail go by made sense. And so they're like, this looks great. So they just went ahead and landed right there. And then just a couple miles up to the north of Independence, there were landing spots that were safe to land your boats. So it didn't take long for the starting point of the Santa Fe Trail not to be in Old Franklin. You didn't start the Oregon Trail game in Old Franklin. You started the Oregon Trail game in Independence. And so that's where you would have started. You would have bought your supplies and then essentially move out west. And taking that old route I'm talking about, which is the one that goes, southwest through Kansas City proper today. Mm-hmm. And the biggest thing is, as you know, is what was the scariest thing to do besides trying to hunt for some squirrel in the Oregon Trail game?
Surviving winter.
Winter was bad too, but that was because you took too long on your journey.
Right.
What was the other, what was the time that you had to spend a little bit of money if you wanted to make it safely across it? You got to ford the river. Right?
That's right. Yes.
Remember? Yeah. And if you paid the money, you could safely get across, or you might lose a wagon. What if you lost an oxen? That was the end of it. That was the end of it. Yes.
What I've always wondered is how much easier it would have been to really discover this nation had people just sailed around and started in Oregon and worked their way backwards, because they were going against the rivers the entire time. Seriously, you're going up the Mississippi when you should be going down it. You're going across the Missouri when you should be going the other way. And you're working double time, even though the rivers may provide that transportation. You're fighting the current the entire time. It's not exactly easy to do that.
6 miles an hour, Missouri River.
Oh my.
Not easy. Yeah, 6 miles an hour. Not good. And steamboats don't even arrive until later. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it would have made a lot more sense. But then I'd also argue that since the settlement starts on the east and moves to the west, that kind of like I always say when I played the Oregon Trail game, if I would have seen that mountain range in front of me, I would have been like, I think I'll stay right here.
I'll turn around and go back.
I'm not turning into some Donner Party.
No, not at all. You don't want to do that. But so you jump on an Independence, and I really find it fascinating that Independence, Kansas City, Westport, Old Santa Fe are all kind of their own cities, and they're so close today, but back then so far apart and almost like rival cities, if you will, at that point in time.
Totally. And what happens is in Independence, you've got to ford the Blue River. So if you think about, and most people don't look at maps like I do all the time, the Blue River empties in between Independence and Kansas City, empties into the Missouri River. So if you pass the Blue River, which is the major river thoroughfare, especially for our bushwhackers, love the Missouri River. or excuse me, the Blue River, because they would hide all over in the brush in there. But like when you think about the Blue River, it's literally the cutoff. So if you can get past Independence, which they of course hadn't figured this out yet, if you could get past Independence and you would dock past Independence further west, you could avoid fording the Blue River, of having to cross it. But they didn't really figure that out at first. And so what ends up happening is Independence, that major trail, is developed. And that's the one that crosses through where I grew up, into 122nd and State Line into Kansas, and emptying into Gardner and then out west.
Mm-hmm.
They also developed another trail, and that was already an Indian trace. So again, this is going to be something that was already there, but they went, we're going to use this too. And it went through essentially where Westport is today. So they kind of forged this trail that moves into the area after Independence is created, and gives time for people to move out west without going. And this would have been more for fur trappers. So they would have used it as kind of a cut through. And so there was a trail that went naturally through like the heart of Kansas City right now from Independence, but there was no Westport there yet. And so then enters in one of my favorite people of the time, which is John Calvin McCoy, founder of Westport, founder of Kansas City. He comes into the picture and he's like, well, wait a minute. He's like 20 years old, which I love. He's like, wait a minute, this is interesting. His family was, he came from, his father was a Baptist minister. So the reason they ended up here was because all the Native Americans were being shoved out west. And so they end up in Kansas City proper. His dad built a log cabin where St. Luke's on the plaza is. And that's where he's living. And all of a sudden he goes, I'm going to buy some land right on this new trail. Why not? And so he buys some land, builds a 2-story.
Who are you buying land from back then? Isn't it just like, didn't you just claim it as yours at that point in time? Like, who are you writing a check to, you know? Because I'm thinking as you're taking this trail out west and you're going through all of this land and going through all of this vast wilderness, why are people just setting up shop? Like, who do you have to buy this land from at that time?
Yeah, the government. So you would, there were different land offices. There was one in Franklin. There was one in Clinton later. One, of course, later in Kansas City. So you had to buy it from the government. So you would usually what they would do is they'd actually go out and look at the land first, squat on it, build a cabin, because in order to purchase land from the government, you had to have a dwelling or something on it.
Oh, okay.
So essentially, you're showing your good measure that you're going to use the land in the to settle.
And they were going to guarantee that they were going to sell it to you after you put in through all this effort and build this stuff. Yeah. And they're not going to like swipe it from you and sell it to a higher bidder.
Right. Exactly. So that's how legal land settlement starts at the beginning. So these guys would settle the land, and most squatters, like in 1843, the area where I grew up, that area wasn't even legally settled until after 1843. And there were people that had been squatting for decades, but again, that was just how it went. People, were you going to fight a guy with a gun in his hand? I don't know. Probably not. No. So yeah, so settlement kind of happens slowly, and independence grows in this massive form that, in the I'd say 1830 to 1840, that's the boom of independence. But then as John McCoy buys land, and there was already a Yoakum's Tavern, which is kind of intertwined in there. I'm like, of course there was a tavern in Westport.
Sure, yeah.
Of course that was the first
right.
building.
Why wouldn't it be?
Why wouldn't it be?
Right.
Yeah,
well, hey, at least it hasn't changed after all these years. You're original, right? Westport can say, hey, we're original, right?
Yes, sticking to their roots.
Yeah.
So John McCoy builds this 2-story, warehouse, if you will. And he's actually the first one who says, this trail, you got to think about how, I don't know how they did it. I would have been so dead. I would have died of smallpox for sure. Back in these days, if he wanted goods from the East, which he had to outfit, he's looking to try to make some money. You had to go to Blue Mills Landing, which is the one by Independence. It took him 3 days round trip to get stuff.
Oh my.
And who wants to do that? And walking, it's just a mess. So he realizes that Shoto's Trading Post, which is in current day downtown Kansas City, he sees that and he's like, there's already a landing point that they used as a ferry, boat crossing. Mm-hmm. And he said, this is big enough for us to drop off here. And so he convinces a steamboat captain. So steamboats are now active. He convinces a steamboat captain to drop some goods at the future site of Westport Landing at the foot of Grand Avenue. And it saved him all this time. So he's like, wait a minute, now I'm going to create this town. So he creates this town around it, Westport, which is 4 miles south of the Westport Landing. And I mean, it kind of starts stealing business because, again, who wants to walk if you can ride?
Right,
So
sure.
it's going to steal business. But I mean, to be clear, independence really stayed the forefront until about the California Gold Rush era, so 1848. I mean, but you got to remember too, and this is where the other trail route runs in. So when you get confused and you wonder how brown signs are everywhere, there's a reason. The Independence, the main route from Independence through my old town of New Santa Fe, you had to cross the Blue River, which was super dangerous. The bridge, which is now the Red Bridge, obviously the name of the street, that wasn't built, the first one, until 1859. So there's no bridge. You got to ford the river, and those are some of the best swales, which is of course created from the weight of the wagon trains. The best swales you'll see in the entire Kansas City metro area is at Minor Park, and I mean they show you how hard it would have been to get up that hill. I mean, it's just no joke.
Right.
And they use these crazy landmarks back in the day, like just like, I don't know if you know, I used to be a runner before my knees gave out on me. And I remember being like, I have to make it to the tree that I see in front of me by this point. Like, you give yourself a target. Like, you have to give yourself a target. Well, these guys had targets too along the Santa Fe Trail. So one of them in my area was called the 4 o'clock Hill House. It was literally called the 4 o'clock house. It's still, I say, standing, the foundation and stuff. The house has been rebuilt, but it's right by St. Thomas More, 118th and Holmes.
Okay.
And so what they do is they cross the Blue River, and they knew they needed to get to the 4 o'clock house by the time they had left Independence by 4. And then they would know they were on time. And then they'd camp where New Santa Fe eventually was, which was a big campground right there because there was a natural spring. And so people that live in the Leawood area, if you know where Royce is today, Royce is a subdivision right across from like Blue Hills and Timber Trace at 125th and State Line. On the Kansas side, there's a pond there. Well, that was a retention pond because there used to be a spring. So people
okay.
Yeah. So that kind of tells you, I mean, you want to camp near water. So, you know, these are all these things that come into play of why people chose the spots that they chose. So after Westport Landing is created and Westport's created, finally he gets people, he was giving land away. Like, just come over here, give me a blacksmith shop, give me a tavern, give me a hotel. I mean, that's how Westport grew. And so then a new route was created. So the next route is what we called the Westport route, which we've gone from Westport Landing at the heart of Grand Avenue. And it would have gone and intertwined into Westport today. And then it went on Warnell Road all the way down to what is now New Santa Fe, or was New Santa Fe, at 122nd State Line. That's the oldest surviving piece of the Santa Fe Trail. Not the oldest, but the longest stretch. And it runs right down Warnell Road. So that was the original Santa Fe Trail.
So could you have made it from Westport Landing downtown to Westport itself in a day, and then on to New Santa Fe in that same day? You would do that all in one day?
Yeah, because you're talking from the foot of Grand Avenue, Westport Landing. Well, if you're outfitting, you're going to get held up because you have to buy supplies. So it's going to be a couple days.
So were Westport Landing and New Santa Fe like competing strip malls, if you will, back in the day?
I hate to say this. The more I've learned, the more I get upset, because I'm like, my little town just, you know, it didn't cut it. You know, it's not there anymore. There's there's another reason for that. But no, I mean, it never grew like Westport Landing because then Westport Landing, they ended up building businesses right there too. Mm-hmm. And then they would have like the hotel there, and then you could go to Westport and outfitted there. And then there was another trail route that went into Kansas about 43rd Terrace and State Line, which is going to be that one that went by Shawnee Indian Mission. They all joined back up together in Gardner. So it's kind of one of those things like, you know, you leave on a road trip and you forget your headphones. You might pick up your headphones in New Santa Fe. You know what I mean? Like that would be kind of what it was like. So, I mean, if you needed repairs after crossing the Blue River, New Santa Fe had you, you know? So yeah, I mean, in New Santa Fe was originally, so there's Westport that's created, there's Independence, and then you have Shawnee Indian Mission that's cashing in also on the travelers. Mm-hmm. And then you also had New Santa Fe, which was incorporated in 1851 as a little town. It eventually had at least 500 people living in it. So it wasn't teeny tiny.
Right.
About the time that it had 500 people, to give you an idea. Kansas City had about 1860, 4,000 people. When Kansas City was created, it was like 700 people. Like, and you think in 1850, it jumps to 4,000. You get into that era. You also have the California Gold Rush, which just completely impacts. So you can't talk about the Santa Fe Trail in this area without talking about the other trails because they're intermingled. I mean, the Donner Party went through here, for crying out loud.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, it's so crazy to think. Fremont, he was in Kansas City or really Westport, and he almost committed suicide. That's a whole nother story. Like, he was in Kansas City in Westport area before he struck gold, and he was broke. And then here, all these friends of his loan him money to try to keep him on his feet. Then he goes out and just like scores.
Yeah, so, hits it big, right in the desert.
Huge, yeah. I mean, it's crazy.
It is, and I think it's interesting. I was going to kind of ask you about, like, when did they start making money? When did they realize they could cash in on this? It wasn't too long after people started coming out here that dudes were setting up shop and making some bucks off these folks, huh?
Well, yeah, no, absolutely no joke. And there's a double whammy with the location of Kansas City. This is why I will argue to the grave that Kansas City is the gateway of the West, partially versus St. Louis, because you have two really distinct things happening at the exact same time. You have Indian removal into Kansas. At the same time, you have the Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail, and the California Trail were pioneers, of course. And to keep in mind that the Santa Fe Trail was used for commerce purposes. You didn't have a lot of women on it, whereas Oregon and California were for families. But at the exact same time that this is happening, just over to the west, you have Native Americans settling. And they have annuities, which means they have money. And so you're not just cashing in as a business owner, serving, selling whiskey to the people who are, going out west. You're selling whiskey to the Native Americans. You're selling, items that they want to the Native Americans, guns, all of that. So that was the happy medium of what Westport had that Independence didn't, is that Westport was right there. So people would travel in. I mean, the reason that the Shawnee Indian Mission was put where it was in 1839 when they moved was because it was so close to Westport. It's because you're going to capitalize on what you have right there.
Sure.
Crazy.
So can you still drive around town today and see like wagon train ruts and things like that? Are those still preserved anywhere?
They are. There's a few. And in my little town of New Santa Fe, there is in the graveyard. You have to go inside the cemetery. It's like the only reason it got preserved is they were like, well, we can't move it because of the grapes. The reason that that graveyard that's at essentially Santa Fe Trail, the straight, and Bellevue, which is just into the east from the state line, that graveyard wasn't originally there. That it was in the 1880s. So it's not as old as people think it is. There was actually another older burial ground that was called Mount Pleasant Cemetery or King Burial Ground that was to the south of New Santa Fe. And what happens with these trails, which is, interesting, you get the ruts inside the best ones, and there's still some over by Bannister Mall if you don't mind ticks. You have to go into the forest, if you will, but there are still some. But really, developers like J.C. Nichols, they got rid of them. They got rid of them. They had to level the land. Now the ones by Minor Park are the best in the city for sure. Yeah. And you can go and walk down there, and it's really breathtaking to see how deep they are. But what happens too with the trail, if you and I'm going to have to kind of reference things because we have people who listen to this from all over, so this won't be so. It's impactful if you look at like a map. That what happens in Independence and also benefited the New Santa Fe area and also the area of Westport was grazing. So cattle, to be able to have your team have a place, especially for Santa Fe traders, up in Independence, that was, of course, if that's one of the first towns, the land up there is more expensive, but people settled it quicker. And so all of a sudden that straight cut through that you had is fenced off, and all of a sudden you're zigzagging all over the landscape. And there was no place for your animals to graze. And so these traders would actually go out, like at the heart of 55th and Ward Parkway was just like a solid campground in the winter.
Oh, wow. And
they would just stay there, and they lay up for the winter, stay in the Westport area, and then they go get their goods early on at Blue Mills Landing. It wasn't until really the whole area developed a little bit more that wasn't the case. So the new Santa Fe area had that same benefit until people started buying land, and which happened later because it was further south. And so if you look at the Santa Fe Trail, even in the 1860s, it zigzags through the landscape because people were like, get off my lawn, literally. So, they ended up moving the route. I know that's crazy, but that's what happened. And so if you look at the route that's around Avila University, you'll see the Santa Fe Trail, and it does not go straight. It's not this diagonal line anymore. It's because of fencing. And it's been that way. It's been that way for forever and ever and ever. It's always been zigzaggy like that, which is kind of, since, people settled. But originally it was like, no, we went straight through your yard. Now they're like, you can't do that. Put up fencing.
I want to leave you with this. When did the trail become irrelevant? When did we start to see the usage go down and people go, screw this, we're building?
Railroad. 1869.
So it wasn't too long really after. Those trails weren't around all that long then, huh?
People used the trails into 1870s and 80s because it's just like trains make money by weight and goods weigh a lot. So there was still some commerce like that, but in general, one of my favorite stories that I've written about before, and this was the California Trail, but was Letty Lipscomb. She was she was 6 years old when she traveled on that Oregon Trail or California Trail with her parents, and she was so bullheaded she wasn't going to sew and cook like her brother or her siblings were doing, and her mother, and her dad bought her a whip and a pony and let her ride the whole way, 6 months. Actually, I think it took him 7 to get to California from basically the Red Bridge area. And then she, in 1874, was called back to Kansas City area because she had an uncle who needed her help. And so she took the train, and she said, what I did in 7 months, I only did in 4 days.
Well, as Diane said, clearly Kansas City is the gateway to the West, and we could argue that for days with our friends over in St. Louis. But when you have 3 major trails taking people out west and expanding this great country of ours, and they all start here in the Kansas City area, I have to agree with Diane. Kansas City really is the true gateway to the West.
Most mortgage lenders charge a fee, sometimes up to 1.5 points for pulling cash out of your home's equity. Those points are on your whole loan balance, not just the cash you get. For example, if your loan amount is $400,000, that's a $6,000 fee. For a limited time, Owning will waive this fee so qualified borrowers can get a cash-out refi with absolutely no closing costs of any kind. Besides the usual no title, escrow, appraisal, etc., no fees for a cash-out on a 30-year fixed mortgage. So if you're in process somewhere and paying fees, call 8332-OWNING or go to owning.com, where our rate and APR for a no cash-out fee 30-year fixed mortgage is 2.75%. But hurry, the mortgage industry won't like this, so who knows when this special goes away. Call 8332-OWNING or go to owning.com.
NMLS 2611, licensed by the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation under the California Residential Mortgage Lending Act. Subject to credit approval. Call 833-303-2160 for terms and conditions. Equal housing lender.
I'm Doc Rivers, and I'm proud to present a new podcast documentary series called It Was Said Sports, where I guide you through 6 of the most impactful and timeless speeches in sports history. Listen and follow It Was Said Sports, a documentary podcast presentation of Shining City Audio, a C13 Originals, and John Meacham Studio. Available now on Odyssey and wherever you listen to your podcasts.
How is your mental health? Billie Eilish, Kevin Love of the Cleveland Cavaliers, Imagine Dragons, Lil Nas X, and so many more feel the same pressures we do. They're joining our host, Carson Daly, for I'm Listening, September 23rd, starting at 6 p.m. right here. Carson and a cast of mental health experts, athletes, musicians, other notables, and you will share stories, insights, and help us all remember that we are not alone. Please join us, because talking about our mental health has the power to save lives. For more, visit imlistening.org.